helping people understand what to do with the land, but ownership, and particularly Black communities, which is a
Absolutely.
massive gap. Massive gap.
Yeah, it's just so critical that we help people figure out how to build that kind of wealth, and you know, that they've been left out of for so long. Well, it's 1:06, and I think it's probably time to start. Looks like we have about 4 or 5 folks out of the 15, so we don't have as many as I was hoping. But welcome to all of you students. And today is October the 20th, which is kind of hard to imagine we've gotten this far this fast. But welcome to all of you, and to those of you that are going to be joining us by watching the recording later. Thanks for tuning in. Today we have the honor and privilege to have Kofi Boone with us, who's is your title director, or what's your title there for the program at NC?
Oh, no, I'm not the director. I'm just a professor.
Oh,
yeah, I'm just a professor, but at NC State. But I am president-elect of the Landscape Architecture Foundation. That's probably the most prestigious title I got. So.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I'm gonna. Oops. Says the connection is poor. Oh, there we go. Looks like we're back. All right. So Kofi, thank you so much for agreeing to be with us today. We've had the pleasure to, as I mentioned, to have Dr. Doug Williams with us, and we had Elizabeth Kennedy a couple weeks ago, Heidi Natura from Chicago, who does all kinds of interesting ecological work. And we had Diane Jones-Allen with us. And in fact, I repaid the favor, and I was on her midterm jury this last Friday, so that was a real pleasure too. She's down at University of Texas in Arlington.
Right.
So several of the folks who were part of that amazing the Twin Pandemics article in the Landscape Architecture magazine back in August have agreed to be with us. And so we're really happy to have you here today. I know that you have a presentation that you'd like to share with us about resilience and resistance, and some of your notes on that. Just for the sake of our students, I want you to know that on Blackboard I've included Kofi's bio, which is quite impressive. Along with, and it also has your contact information if anybody wants to get hold of you to talk a little bit more about what you're doing, and maybe a little bit about your program there at NC State University.
Sure.
Also, I've included 2 of your articles. You gave me some links, and just to make sure that we can sort of keep everything in place and things don't get lost over time, I took that information and put it into Word and then saved it as a PDF.
Sure.
So I think I've sent that to you. So hopefully that's of some value to you if you want to share that besides just having a link. But I tried to include everything and kept the formatting pretty much all the same and all that. So there's 2 articles, one about the importance of Black landscapes and why those matter. So if you want to talk a little bit about that, one of the things that you had a quote from Jelani Cobb: "The myth of white supremacy is the lack of recognition of mutuality." And I thought that was neat how you talked about that, and then kind of turning towards health, safety, and welfare as far as our practice, and that in the same kind of mutuality sense that Black landscapes really matter too, and that when you harm them, you're also harming everybody. So that's a universal kind of idea. And then the other article, I'm sorry, I forget the name of it now. It was a conversation that you had with someone, I guess maybe it was on Zoom, where you got into a number of different issues. So there's other things in there that you'd like to bring out. That'd be great too.
Sure. Yeah, you just let me know when to jump in. So I'm getting the pace of the conversation. If you want me to kind of jump in, I can do that.
Yeah, I think we're ready. I mostly just wanted to kind of let the students get some general sense of who you are and that, you're teaching there at North Carolina State University. I'd love to go back. We started out the conversation just sort of that you and I before some of the students got on, you sharing a little bit of your own personal journey. I know you
Sure.
grew up in Detroit, but if you could just talk a little bit about kind of your parents, your family, your whole sort of journey in school, the fact that
Sure.
you started out in music at Interlochen
Yeah.
Camp up there in northern Michigan.
Right.
I think that's all valuable kind of background to helping our students see kind of how you've gotten to where you are so that they can begin to get some windows into how they might move into this same profession in some way or another.
Sounds good. First of all, I'll just say thank you for the invitation. It's great to participate. It's great to hear names of friends that I know extremely well. I was just trading notes with Diane Jones Allen 30 minutes before I got on this call. So it's a really small world. So I'm really glad that you all are getting an opportunity to expose these things. Yeah, my name is Kofi Boone. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. My family is from Washington, D.C. And one reason why that matters is my grandfather, John Robinson, was a self-taught artist from Anacostia. So if you're familiar with Washington, D.C., Anacostia is the southeast side of the city, and grew up with art, appreciation, and creativity just in the family. My mother went on to get a BFA from then Baltimore Institute, now Maryland Institute, and was a commercial artist and became a state director of the Michigan Council for the Arts and Culture for many years. And so I grew up in sort of an arts household. Even in Detroit, there was and still is a very strong art and culture scene. Fell in love with music. So even though I was exposed to visual art, I fell in love with music and uh, wanted to become a professional musician. And in Michigan, there's a performing arts school that has a camp, but also has Frozen. Okay. Just I saw the picture for you. So, and somehow your audio is going out.
I turn that off. I think what I'm going to do is move my computer. I think the problem might be on my end, so if you'll just bear with me just for a second. I had this problem the other day as well, so hold on just for a second.
No problem.
Sorry about that.
Oh, don't worry about it. It's okay. So music, that led me to Interlochen, Northern Michigan, which is very non-urban, no black folks, totally different culture. But while I was there, in addition to music performance and classes, a lot of ecology and biology classes, and that was my first exposure to the natural world and to issues of ecology. And in particular, a math science camping trip had a huge influence on me, where we were on North Manitou Island, which used to be a small farming and milling island off the coast of Michigan. That was now sort of a nature preserve, and we were there by ourselves for 4 days with just us and the elements, and that really had a heavy impact on my life. I wanted to learn more about that and how that could connect to art and to music and the other things I was interested in. And went to University of Michigan, which has a school of natural resources, which is where landscape architecture is, and got taken in by the department head there at the time, Kim Polagowski, who brought me through. And the Michigan years are important because while I was there, first of all, as a freshman there, uh, was right after the Black Action Movement. So it was on the heels of massive protests on campus by Black students and faculty and others to advocate for the creation of all kinds of things that the university enjoys today in terms of scholarships and other elements to increase access to the university. And so I kind of came in on the wave of that sort of activism. And while I was there, it was the academic beginnings of the environmental justice movement. And so a number of leading scholars in that movement were at Michigan at that time. So people like Bunyan Bryant and Paul Mohai and a number of other folks. And so that had a heavy influence on how I thought about landscape architecture as not just something for leisure and for people with free time and for the preservation of the non-human side, but that there's a very human component to it that has to also grapple with the legacy of race and colonialism and all the things that we're talking about right now. Those are things that were topics back then. So that's who I am and that's where I'm from.
Wow. And what year did you start as a freshman at University of Michigan?
1988. So,
Okay.
which was a good year. So, just to give you some context, uh, uh, that was the highest enrollment of Black people at Michigan ever. So it was just under 8%.
Okay.
Michigan won the national title in basketball that year,
All right.
as well as the Rose Bowl in football, as well as the championship in hockey, and was ranked number 3 overall of all universities. It was only $1,500 a semester for in-state tuition.
Wow.
So,
Nice.
I was lucky to graduate from undergrad and grad debt free.
So your undergraduate degree is in what?
My undergraduate degree is in natural resources with a
Okay.
focus on policy. So it's if I'd taken another 6 elective credits, I could have double majored with biology. But it's
Okay.
a natural resources degree.
And then can you tell us a little bit about how you got from natural resources into design and landscape architecture? Like what was that path like?
Yeah, well, I'd say more broadly, Michigan represents and NCA&T State represents another part of the chair. There was a period of time when landscape architecture was considered a design profession, was aligned with either architecture or engineering. And actually, our program at Michigan was the same boat. It was in engineering for many years. But there was a really important book that came out called Design with Nature that was written by Ian McCarg, who was the founding chair of the landscape architecture program at University of Pennsylvania. And what he put on the table was how could landscape architects profess to be these great stewards of the landscape and have expertise when we don't understand our materials. So if we don't know anything about soils or trees or ecosystems or habitats, we could be doing more harm than good. And so he kind of rang that bell. That
Yeah.
rippled through our entire profession. And at that time, programs were shifting. So some stayed with horticulture, some stayed with agriculture, some stayed with engineering. But Michigan moved to natural resources as a direct response to the call that McCarg put out. And the founding dean of that reconstituted program was the only landscape architect to ever be a dean of the School of Natural Resources at Michigan, a guy named Bill Johnson, founder of Johnson Johnson Roy, which is where I worked for many years after I graduated. So that's why. So we were the sort of the design wing in the environmental house, so to speak.
Got it. So tell us a little bit more about your story getting your master's degree in landscape architecture and then your practice. Kind of what did that look like and what kinds of projects were you working on and maybe a little bit about kind of your, I don't know if it was a shift or it was just like a whatever in terms of thinking more socially and not just environmentally and ecologically.
Yeah, it's a good question, and so I think that that shift happened before I started. So I kind of had a living memory of growing up in my hometown of Detroit and seeing some of the disparities there in terms of how different places were, had great places, and other parts of town didn't. And some parts were growing and some parts didn't. And I didn't understand the complexity of it or even the role of design and all of that. But some of that was spinning around in my head. And while I was in undergrad and grad, I referenced before environmental justice, there were a number of faculty there that were teaching classes that were tied to those particular issues. And so at that time, it was really about toxics. So, people wanted to cite, a freeway or a generator plant or some other kind of toxic use. But they were always picking on Black and brown communities, for a lot of reasons, which are probably, worth another talk. But, it was through those courses that got the sense that there was it wasn't just an anecdote, just wasn't what I was feeling emotionally. There were actually real things like policies, decisions, like actors, so to speak, that were facilitating this. And if you could do that, then you could undo it. right? So you can change a policy, right? You can counter a decision. So that was going on one side of the house, and the other side of the house spinning around were like the basics of learning landscape architecture, how to communicate graphically, which is a challenge for a lot of people. How to understand ecosystems, grading and drainage, like those things are happening like in parallel. They really came together in our master's final project. So at Michigan, we were required to do a team project as a final instead of a thesis. And as a part of that process, we had to recruit teammates from other disciplines, and we had to pick, a project. So we picked an action project for our final project, and that was on the east side of Detroit, in a black community with a lot of waterfront, riverfront land. Detroit's on the river, that was zoned residential. But the people in that neighborhood that didn't have access to open space elsewhere relied on that land for their open space access. And they were afraid that because of the zoning, that was going to become developed and they were going to take it away. So our project became a multi-year project that first year focused on community engagement, to understand the needs of the community, and set up 2 additional years after we graduated. And this was really hard to persuade, the dean and the chair of our department that, look, we're not going to be done when we graduate. We're going to recruit 2 more generations of students, pick up the baton, and 3 years later, you're going to get this project. So that took a
Wow.
lot, but we did it. And so that first year,
Very entrepreneurial on your part to
yeah. So yeah, our whole team. Yeah, it wasn't just me. It was our team. That's an advantage, is that in our profession, it's very rare when you do things by yourself. So learning how to work together in teams and work with different people is important. But the point is that we built the structure in the first year. Second year, those students did precedents and case studies and tried to find funding sources. The third year actually did the design, and they successfully got it rezoned. So at the end of this whole arc, it wasn't just an academic kind of process. It like resulted in actual change. And so
oh,
I interned at Carol Johnson Associates in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which at that time was the largest woman-owned firm in the country, maybe in the world at the time. And so I got that internship experience between my second and third year in grad school. And that changed my life, because up to that point, everything I knew about landscape architecture was whatever was in my world, right? My frame of reference, where I came from. And so that was my first time going to Boston, even to visit. That was my first time living for an extended period outside of my hometown of Detroit. That experience in the Emerald Necklace that Frederick Olmsted laid out, like for real. Going to the GSD and seeing the great work of Sasaki, Michael Van Valkenburg, and that kind of stuff, like in real life. Living without a car, so relying on the T for public transportation. Like there were all these, like, not just academic lessons, but these life lessons about really the value that landscape can make. And was out of that internship. My third year was a blur. It just kind of flew by because I had a new, sense of mission, right? That this was really the right fit for me. And I did not return to Carol Johnson. I ended up taking a position at JJR at Smith Group, and working there for 10 years, and a lot on projects in my hometown in Detroit. If you ever go to the Detroit Riverwalk and enjoy the transformation on the river, that's something that we did. Milliken Tricentennial State Park, which was the first state park in the city of Detroit. That's something that we did. A number of other projects around that are now getting new light and new attention because of, at least in the last couple of years, a renaissance in the city. So it was nice to play a role in that as a professional. And then coming to North Carolina, because I was married to a woman who was a physician. She got a fellowship at UNC Chapel Hill. So we moved sight unseen to support that part of her career, and that's what brought me south. That's what brought me teaching. Mm-hmm.
And how did you make the transition into teaching? What did that look like?
Oh, it was interesting because as the students can probably attest, sometimes you're excited about new blood, sometimes you're not. Sometimes as a faculty member, I think you probably know too that after a while, sometimes it's not the message sometimes doesn't get through, so to speak. I think it was a really critical time in our department at NC State, because at that point, most of our faculty had been there for many years and hadn't practiced, right? So they didn't have a current understanding of what was required for practice. So there were 2 hires, myself and my friend Leanne Milburn, who's now in California at Cal Poly. But the two of us, and that was a part of it, was to kind of rejuvenate, re-energize. And there aren't, many faculty of color or black faculty as well. So there was a little bit of a culture shock. And as someone coming out of a professional office, where the expectation is the product, right? What you produce at the end. It's a very high bar. Uh, Teaching is more about the process, about learning, right? So I had to reprogram because at first I came in the classroom treating it like a studio, like a professional studio. I was like, yo, what's going on here? Like, this isn't the bar. Like, this is what you got to do. It took a while for me to readjust and say, well, you're supposed to learn that, right? They don't know that.
Yeah.
So I think I've come over that hump, I hope.
And how long have you been teaching now?
I started tenure track in '04, so it's just over 15 years now at NC State.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not transition into what you like to talk about, but one thought that occurred to me was that it might be good to at least open the floor and see if any of the students who are on right now would like to ask you anything right now about anything that you've already shared with us.
Yeah, and I just need to say the presentation is there. I don't feel compelled to share it. If it's useful, I will. But if it's just this conversation between you and I and the class, I'm great with that too. So I don't have any expectations. I'm just here to be a service. So whatever helps you, I'm happy to do.
Okay. Let me just open the floor then to our students and see if they have anything they'd like to ask you about your program or about you and your journey so far. Anybody who's on right now? Looks like there's about 10 of us that are on. I will say this, that, oh, looks like Martrell. Did you have your hand up, Martrell?
I do.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I looked at the Black Landscapes Matter, the article you wrote, and I'm not really hold on, I have to actually rethink about this real quick.
Okay. Yeah, if it's helpful, I can talk about why I wrote that.
I guess that would be my question. Yeah.
Why I wrote it. Yeah. It's a good question. So there are two reasons. One is you can go your entire academic and professional career and never hear reference to a Black designer, a Black community, a theory that a Black person generated, anything outside of a focus on Black people. You can go and it's not just landscape, it's all the design professions are devoid of what we call the canon of experience. And I'm going to go back to my Michigan experience. When Toni Morrison won the Pulitzer Prize for Beloved, she spoke at Michigan like that year. And I'll be honest, we all fell asleep during her talk. We were a bunch of kind of undergrads, no disrespect. We didn't take it as seriously as we should. But I've had a chance to reread the speech she gave at Michigan. And what she talked about was expanding the canon, saying that it's cool if you're learning English to learn the classics, to learn Shakespeare, to learn Greek tragedy, to learn all of these things. It's not to diminish the value and lessons that those are learned, but that there are a lot of other stories out there that aren't even just about elevating the group of people that they're coming from, but to provide something of value to the entire understanding of how literature works. And so that was the spirit of the article. And it was the idea that I'm now in a position of power. Right? I'm a professor, president-elect of the Landscape Architecture Foundation. I'm in this situation now where I understand what it takes to reshape how we think about things. So it came out of that level of responsibility. And what really prompted it was Walter Hood, one of your alumni. He sent out a call a few years ago on the anniversary of the Rodney King verdict. and what it did in Los Angeles, and said, "Hey, we need to do this symposium uh, in Berkeley, about these issues." And I was like, "Well, what's the topic?" He goes, "Well, Black Landscapes Matter," is what he said. And I said, "You got any more for me? Like anything else?" And he said, "No, you'll figure it out." So show up at Berkeley. Y'all had Diane Jones Allen here. Her husband, Austin Allen, another prominent landscape architect, filmmaker as well. He was there. There were a number of us who gave presentations. And so that article specifically was in response to the call that Walter made, but more generally was to say that we're in a position now to rethink how we tell our story and to really challenge why we're not in it, and to think creatively about how to elevate those stories and that perspective so that it's a part of landscape architecture. Right? It's not in a box or on an edge. And so it really kind of honed in on a few moments that a lot of people don't really talk about. I don't know about your experience coming from Michigan to the South. You should know that if you hung out with people like me when I was a kid, we thought the whole South was racist. We were like, never living down there. So the whole narrative and the whole story of how where we are now is portrayed is really negative in the Midwest, right? It's really negative in other parts of the country. And in terms of landscape architecture, uh, that's hard because two of the critical acts that enable an American landscape architecture were colonialism, right? So elimination of indigenous people, and slavery, right? Which was centuries of free labor, essentially transforming the landscape. And so part of it was about coming to grips with that legacy and saying, if we're talking about landscape architecture in the United States, particularly history, you're not acknowledging colonialism, you're not acknowledging slavery, and you're really not talking about the history of landscape architecture. And as painful and traumatic as that history is, I tried to pick examples of still where African people and African culture provided innovation to how we think about things. And so zeroed in on Middleton Place is one of what could be a whole slew of examples of how even in the midst of all of that trauma, that African people were creative, they were productive, they were able to take lessons from what they learned wherever they're from and apply them in a new context and provide value. And so from there it was off to the races, like what people don't know about black towns, or most people in our profession don't know anything about HBCUs. The roles that people played may not have called themselves landscape architects, may not have been trained in the same way as landscape architects. They were practicing landscape architecture. So that was the spirit of it. It's getting reconstituted in Walter's book, which comes out in a couple of weeks by the same name that he and Grace Tata edited, which is sort of a collection of what happened at that particular symposium. And it sat on the shelf for 3 years. So this is a true story. I wrote it 3 years ago. Nobody read it. Right, but it was in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd in particular that it got currency. Like people picked it up and they saw value in it, and so it's been a really interesting period since then of trying to reconcile that right now, deal with that responsibility. So.
Thanks, Martrell. Anyone else? Do you have anything else you'd like to say, or is there anyone else who has a question for Kofi? Tell us a little bit about your resilience and resistance in that set of notes, Kofi, and what kind of where that came from, and if you'd like to share some of your presentation or all of it, however much you'd like, that'd be great too. But we'd love to kind of hear where, like how you've gotten to where you are at this point, and what kind of key message you'd like to share with us.
Sure, I can do that, and then if it's helpful, I can share some images, but I can talk about a conversation first, and if there are questions along the way, please feel free. Resilience comes from psychology as a term. So it's really about how you respond to trauma. And in some cases, you bounce back. You return to the state you were before that traumatic incident occurred. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you get back to a spot where you can function, in the same way you did before that traumatic incident occurred, but you're in a different place. So resilience, but in its big connotation, is the ability to recover from trauma. And so it's been applied to our world, landscape architecture, and has replaced sustainability in some ways as a way of describing our mission in the age of climate change. And so I'll say, when I was in your shoes as students, we didn't talk about climate change very much. We talked about a lot of other things. We didn't talk about climate change. That is the issue of this century: is how do we adapt to a world that's heating up because of greenhouse effect and carbon emissions. And landscape architecture is really in the lead in that regard, because a lot of people see what we do with the land as having a direct impact on our ability to resist and to fight climate change. So you'll hear about certain projects. There's some where there, areas that flood. There people are being relocated, and they turn those into spaces that can tolerate flood. You'll hear about seawalls. You'll hear about a lot of other things that are physical infrastructure design projects. Often, what's not talked about is culture and history and heritage, and the fact that as we move forward to figure out how to make our world adapt to the time to come, we have to be just as mindful of people. And so the notes on resilience and resistance is really talking about that issue, built around a couple of places that try and offer as case studies to explain how people have tried to meet that challenge, right? How do you build a more resilient community based on what's moving, or particularly with floods? And it was really prompted by Hurricane Matthew, which at NC State was, really a very important event, because that was the first time as a department, landscape architecture, we really talked about, well, how can we be of service? Part of our mission as a land grant institution is to make, the knowledge that we have available to the citizens of the state and beyond. And so what's the best use of that? And so we began to do that, right? Like, how do we engage communities in different ways? How do we, help build their capacity to be able to move forward after this occurs, assuming that this is just the beginning, right? That everything we know about climate change is that hurricanes, flooding events, extreme weather events are going to become more common and more intense as time goes by. So we're going to have to be better and better prepared to handle it. So the notes touch on a few cases. It talks about how difficult, in particularly Black folks and Black communities, it's been to stay in place and build wealth and build social cohesion and all the things that we know help communities be more resilient, and the need to kind of address that. And then it goes through a few different places, including Princeville, North Carolina, which is the first and oldest free charter town founded by Black people in the United States, about an hour north of Raleigh on the Tar River. And so it kind of features some of the work that we've done there. So, those are the broad arcs, but try to do in the cases is show where young people, student action, collaboration with communities with potential for that to occur. It's different from like an expert flying in and getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars, or someone doesn't have a connection. Those are important ways of doing it. That's more of how we operate in landscape architecture, to be quite frank. But it's not the future. The future is more about partnership and collaboration and longer term work beyond the scope of, say, a traditional project. In our case, with Princeville and with Hurricane Matthew in these communities, it's going on 4 years of engagement. We're discovering that that's really closer to what's required in order to make things move forward. So that's
And
sort of the talking point.
Kofi, are these student projects that you work on over a semester or a whole academic year? What does that look like in terms of the work that you all are doing?
Well, they vary, right? They vary. So maybe it's a good time to talk about a few examples. One.
Also, I'm seeing that we have two other folks that have raised their hands, Brittany and Roman. So at some point, I want to bring them to the conversation.
Yeah, we can stop now. Yeah, so I'm happy to answer those questions. Yep.
Brittany, do you have something you want to ask?
It was kind of before, so it's not.
Okay, feel free.
Everything you mentioned, like real estate and something with that, and I just wanted to see your.
Sorry, you're breaking up. What about, I heard real estate, but I didn't understand what you wanted to know about it.
Brittany, if you're having trouble with your microphone, you might try just typing in the chat. And I don't know how familiar you are with this, Kofi, but if you hit the little purple tab in the bottom right, that opens up an opportunity to see the chat.
Gotcha. Yeah. So let's see. I think I got it. All right. So something about real estate. Well, what I will say is I don't know what the second article is that you shared. I got to double check. But I co-wrote an article with a colleague who teaches at Tufts University, a guy named Julian Edgemont, who is a planning professor. He's actually going to be in our lecture series, so we'll, make sure we advertise that since it's all on Zoom. You don't need to travel to come here and speak. But he's an international expert on issues of sustainability and environmental justice. I had a chance to interview him for Landscape Architecture magazine last year. So there's an article about that conversation. But what we decided to write about together was, in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement and all of the social unrest, social insurrections that are occurring, worldwide, there was an underlying issue, particularly with Black folks in the United States, about land and land ownership. That a lot of the concerns that were being raised about how government has historically treated Black communities, how it's dealt with it in terms of the economic systems, has not really talked about equity in terms of land. And so what we did was we went back through history and talked about cooperatives and land trusts as ways of engaging Black communities who don't have a lot of economic resources to pool their resources together to acquire and control land. And it revealed a lot of really shocking things. Like one is, over 98% of land that used to be owned by Black people is not anymore. We're at 2%. And a lot of that has to do with urban migration after slavery and Reconstruction. That a lot of land that was owned by Black people where we are in the Southeast, either intentionally or unintentionally, was sold or apportioned or acquired by others. And so there aren't a lot of good statistics on urban land ownership by Black folks, but it's about the same proportion. And so part of that was driven by that observation that, we do what we can with policy, with rules, with law. We do what we can through individual design projects, bit by bit. But another frontier is how can landscape architecture and design and planning, what we do with regards to equity, also result in empowering Black communities directly and helping them acquire and control land. So that was that piece. So with regards to real estate, it depends on where you are. Fast-growing urban centers are very difficult to acquire and control property. And when we start talking about issues of gentrification and displacement, a lot of that has to do with Black folks and many communities don't own their land, their property. And high percentage of renters. We're working in South Park, East Raleigh right now. About 70% of that property is rental. So it looks stable, it looks under control, but and many of those property owners that rent that property don't live in that particular community. And so their incentive when property values increase is to make an economic profit. And so that's the force that displaces people, right? Is the idea that if you own or control the land, you'd have much more power to be able to resist that in a different kind of way. So in other communities, like smaller communities, rural communities, a little easier to control and own property, but those don't have the economic forces, the pressure of redevelopment. And so that becomes a different kind of conversation. But with regards to real estate, I don't know if that answered the question, but that was the gist of the article, was how to learn from the past. Great work of Fannie Lou Hamer, if you're into the civil rights movement, was really the mother of land trusts in the United States with her work in Mississippi decades ago. But before her, W.B. Du Bois was writing about cooperative banks and black co-ops, and really how to pool resources. People don't have a lot of individual resources, how you can collect them together and use them collectively to make change. So we were recovering some of that past.
Roman, do you have a question?
Yeah. Do you think the wildfires in California will have a negative result on the industry?
Landscape architecture?
Yes.
No, I don't. Uh, I think it's just giving evidence of how, and it's giving evidence of why we shouldn't plan in the way that we are in those kinds of environments. So there are a lot of reasons why wildfires are occurring in California. It is linked to climate change for sure, in terms of because also extended drought is another consequence of this. It's not just big floods and rain events, but urban heat island effect, the planet heating up, and extended periods of no rain. But a lot of it also is management in terms of how those regions were planned and designed, where they allowed people to build in places and did not allow the environmental processes that are required to regenerate those landscapes to occur. So, for example, let's say you make $10 million. You go out into the middle of gorgeous Northern California, countryside, surrounded by prairie, and all kinds of local landscapes, but you prefer grass and you don't think controlled burning, which is required for the maintenance of these systems, they're supposed to burn, uh, should happen. So you go and you lobby, your local officials, and you're like, look, we shouldn't allow burning here for X, Y, and Z reason, which then builds up the landscape to essentially be kindling, right? So it's just sitting there waiting for anything from a lightning strike to someone's cigarette to some other entity to happen. So part of this is a reflection on the need for good regional ecosystem planning and strategies to control that kind of thing. So those landscapes are designed to burn. They burn more frequently. They don't burn as hot, and they don't do as much damage. But that's an attitude adjustment that people need for landowners are out there. You can design landscapes to not be fireproof, but to manage fire. So there are whole new innovations in how we design landscapes that make them more resistant to fire and those kinds of things. So I think that's going to be a lot of work for landscape architects there moving forward in terms of people. But what it's requiring is another level, right? We think of landscape architecture often as sort of the site, the property line that we're working in. But we're using forces that don't pay attention to property lines and that require maintenance strategies and ways of approaching them that go way beyond what an individual can do. And so it's showing how landscape is multi-scalar, right? You deal with the site, you deal with the community, but then you're dealing with whole ecosystems and watersheds. That's what California has to do. And I know that there are leading landscape architects out there that are talking about that right
That was all. Thank you.
Kofi, one of the articles that I sort of put into PDF format was on race and cultural landscapes.
Yep.
And it seemed like a slightly different kind of turn on what you were trying to say. And I wonder if you care to share a little bit of what you were hoping to impart in that article.
that through what Cultural Landscape Foundation is that Charles Birnbaum's thing? Yeah, I was just talking to Charles last week. I'm doing the thing at Harvard. That article is interesting because the gist of it was at that time, and I still think about it. There are a lot of efforts afoot to include Black and Brown people in landscape architecture. I think a number of you, I know Chris has been organizing, a big internship program, which has been very successful. Congratulations on that. By the way, I think your success rate is much higher than even NC State, so that's just amazing in terms of placement. So I salute you on that. Where I was coming from in that article was the work that we have to do in landscape architecture to make sure that we are desirable and comfortable in a place where Black and brown folks can thrive. So it was sort of one way of looking at it is that landscape architecture is so great, you should be a part of it. Let's go get people and bring them in, and we don't change as a profession, right? I mean, to just be real with you, right?
Yep.
That article was putting on the table. Well, sure, and it's kind of was referencing a really famous quote from Dr. King, Dr. Martin Luther King, where he said, "You know, sometimes I feel like I'm integrating my people into a burning house."
Oh,
What he was, so everybody likes the doc, I Have a Dream, Dr. Martin Luther King, the that kind of side of it, right? There was another side of Dr. King, right? That came out in letters in Birmingham jail. That came out after his experiences in Chicago, in particular. That talked more about not just uh, uh, changing rules and policy, but really changing power, dealing with economics, dealing with war, like dealing with those. And that's when he became unpopular. So this is right at that tipping point where he was sort of like looking at, I've been spending my whole life trying to convince people to say we need to integrate into the United States. Country's so great, it's our place. He kind of took a second and he kind of went, man, I don't know. There's just a lot of problems that have nothing to do with us. And if I'm not honest about the need for the house to change, what am I doing trying to encourage people to come in? So I kind of pulled on that and said, currently there are a lot of barriers to how we practice landscape architecture business as usual that make it difficult for people who are trying to make that decision to come in. And so part of the role is for us that are in these positions now is to think about that critically. And I'd say that many organizations are. So one example, American Society of Landscape Architects, brand new CEO, Black gay man as a CEO of landscape architecture. Now, when you think of landscape architecture, you're probably not thinking of a gay Black man. Right? You're probably thinking about something else. And a guy that's not a landscape architect. So Troy is not a landscape architect. He was an accountant associated with advocating for immigrant rights. He was selected because he's a great leader. Right? And though his lens, right, just his life experience as they go into the strategic plan is forcing him to look through all of the processes that American Society of Landscape Architects is working on to see how it plays out, right? So for the first time, there is a champion at the top that's going to be talking about issues of equity, of justice, of diversity, of inclusion, not just lip service, right? And if it is lip service, there's a way to find out. Black Landscapes Architects Network started, right? So Glenn Smith, the president, right? We're all on the advisory board. That didn't exist before. There was never a Black-led organization focused on landscape architecture. Their mission, right? Money, mentorship, internships, connections, right? That will grow. LAF, right? The organization I represent, Landscape Architecture Foundation. Several years ago, there was a summit. Out of that came the new Landscape Declaration, which are sort of our marching orders in terms of where our mission happens to be. For the first time, mainstream environmental organization, landscape architecture, talking about environmental justice and equity as missions of landscape architecture. And these are like people at Peter Walker and Partners and Sasaki and Design Workshop and every kind of coffee table book firm you can imagine. They're on the board of landscape architecture. We went through a DEI training because we knew that as a group, we didn't have the vocabulary, we didn't have the language, we didn't have basic rules for having real critical conversations about this stuff. So organizational transformation is occurring as we're going. CELA, the same thing, Council of Educators and Landscape Architects. So really in a really interesting moment. And so that article preceded that, right? That interview preceded all of that change. This is even before George Floyd, this is before COVID. We had our conversation. But that was the idea, was that we need to do more work as a profession so that when we talk to people like you all, we say, hey, landscape architects are a great profession. You should pursue it. We'll support you. That there's actually some meat on those bones.
so I'm not, this is a slightly unformed question, but it kind of has to do with how you started what you just said in terms of, yes, it's great that we've that we're trying to provide more opportunities for internships for students from an HBCU to get connected into the practicing professionals, sector. But how do we make that sort of cultural change within the profession as a whole, and what role does A&T and other university programs play in that? I mean, obviously part of that is just us even having a class like this where we're trying to get as many practicing African American professionals and teachers and that sort of thing to just talk about these things with us. But how do we kind of expand that? A week or so ago, I went to an online open house for it was Black Matters University. It's probably 150 primarily professional teaching kind of folks, all saying we got to do this within the academic setting. So I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that and kind of where you think we can go with this and how we can help our students be a part of that kind of cultural change within our profession.
Yeah. So yeah, Dark Matters University. Yeah. So that was a response mostly led by architects, but with some landscape architecture incorporated in that. Yeah, I think DMU is great. I'm going to be giving a talk with Brian Lee tomorrow at Berkeley, so that's going to come up in terms of that as a strategy. I think I'll start with the base. When I was in school, there were 3 HBCUs with accredited programs. So A&T was first, in '94. But also there was Florida A&M and Morgan State as a graduate program. So since then, Florida A&M has lost their accreditation. They don't offer landscape architecture anymore. We actually received a few of their students once that happened and helped them finish their undergraduate degrees in aftermath of that. So part of it, I would say that HBCUs are critical to that. In the same manner, they're critical to every profession. I mean, it's almost any profession you can name, and A&T in particular is outstanding for engineering in terms of producing the most Black engineers and placing the most Black engineers of any university in the country. So the idea that people come to HBCUs for a particular reason, cultural experience, and that builds your ability to then develop the technical skills to go out into the world. A&T offers an incredible model and that we should learn from, and that particular other schools should learn from. So part of it is really championing the role that HBCUs play in the whole system, which I don't think has happened to the level it should, especially if we're focused on getting more Black folks in. What we've been talking about a lot, and Chris knows as well, because we've talked about this, Harrison, is that there are points in the chain in the career pathway where people leave. Right? So early, when do you know about the profession? Right? How do you find out about it? Like that's one. Most of us find out really late. Most of us find out as adults. Most of us, it's a career shift, right? Well, what happened if we really gave a concerted effort K through 12 to expose the profession to those generations and to their families and to other folks to figure out what it is? Right. So that's a spot. You get in, right? Congratulations, you got in. It's expensive, right? You got lots of materials to buy, software, apps. It's expensive in time. All your friends and other disciplines get to go out and party on the weekend. You get to do all these other things. Nope, you're in studio, right? There's a whole list of studies about the intensity of the program. You can't afford to stay and got to work part-time. You can't take as many classes, slows down your graduation, right? So there's sort of the mechanics while you're in it, as well as the resources, right? So resources help, right? So money, scholarships, other things while you're in it. But that's a break, right? So people leave not because they don't want to do it or they're not good enough because they can't afford it. So that's a gap. Another gap, getting professional experience. If I didn't have an internship from Carol Johnson, that opened up so many doors where people would literally see that on my resume and they wouldn't even look at my portfolio. They were like, if you worked at that firm, you're good. Come through. So the idea of placement and professional expertise. And for me, and if you're looking at an internship, being able to come back and reflect on your academic career and say that it's not all defined by what I'm learning in the classroom. I'm in a real place now where I have to test it out, and then it's a way to measure, like, I need to improve at this, or I'm doing really well at this, or this inspired me to look in a totally different direction, having that third data. So that's another break. People who get a degree but never had an internship. Right? So their first professional experience is a job, right? That's really hard. A job, right? That's the next break, right? When you get the first job, that's the last job, first job. But that idea of how do I prepare for licensure, right? How do I make sure that I'm being mentored effectively so that I'm not just being dumped on a bunch of projects, but I can play a role in defining which way I want to go, right? In that critical period when you graduate, 2 years before you can sit the entire exam to get licensed, if you like to be licensed. If you don't want to be licensed, what are other opportunities? And so in landscape architecture, that's the fastest growing sector, are areas where people are trained in landscape architecture, but they're not practicing as a licensed landscape architect, but their thinking is adding value to wherever they are, right? Almost like a law degree. Like most people who have law degrees aren't lawyers, right? But that legal training allows them to add value wherever they are. So there's that gap. And then, if gender plays a role, you say you want to start a family, for women in particular, that's a huge break, particularly in architecture, which is in the time that you're taking care of critical life needs. There are other people who are single and who are male, who are just flying right by you because they don't have those kind of things. Unfair. So there's multiple breaks in the system, and the thought is, how can we work collectively to fill those, and how can we be proactive in helping particularly Black and Brown students to be pioneers in that regard, because we don't have the numbers that we want. And so if we realize there are all these breaks, how can we play an active role in stitching those together and helping people move through?
It sounds like you just went through the whole strategic plan. Is that part of where all that came from? Because it seems like it's like you have it so clearly articulated in terms of all these different breakpoints.
Well, it's not ASLA's strategic plan, but we talk a lot about this at LAF, for sure. And I know that Chris has as well, because I've had conversations with Chris about this topic. So yeah, it's definitely out there. And as a benchmark, Women in Landscape Architecture, which is an organization, but also Equity by Design, which is a much larger organization focused on women in architecture, has been thinking about it in this way, dealing with gender for a number of years now. So there's data out there. There's pretty well established stuff. Now we're thinking about it in terms of race, and I think that so it's an interesting time to talk about it.
And how does that message get out to the practicing professionals? I mean, how do you start to take what you just talked about and make it more pedestrian in terms of everybody's kind of seeing this as the next place to go? I mean, you mentioned Troy and as the new CEO and all that. So, like, is that part of ASLA's mission?
It's not, but it's an interesting period where everybody is recrafting it. So, there's some people say that protest doesn't result in anything, right? That why are people out in these streets, right? They're not going to get anything. Well, protest always results in something. It may not always be something that you want, but it's disruptive. And what it meant for landscape architecture was really critically reflecting on this blind spot, right?
Yeah.
And so whether or not it pans out, I don't know. But organizationally, I know that each organization independently is examining these particular issues and figuring out what their role wants to be. And, we're trying to figure out how to coordinate it so that we're cooperating and working together. But I know each individual organization has been doing that. So, LAF, our scholarships, which is one of the strengths of what we do. We're looking at it in that regard. ASLA, in terms of the diversity summits they've been having for many years, and an action plan that they in the past have not really moved forward on. But through Lisa Jennings, they're one of their leaders there. They're trying to really reflect on that and work on that. So as with everything, the challenge is coordination. But I think it will reveal itself in these strategies moving forward, because everybody really is talking about it.
Yeah. I have a couple of questions about, number one, the network that you mentioned, uh, and how our students can get connected into that. And then the second question I have is about your program there at NC State, and if there's anything you'd like to share about that in terms of that being one of the options for our students.
Happy to do it. So the first thing is the Black Landscape Architects Network, also known as Black Land. So I think you can Google it now. It was started informally 10 years ago by Glenn Smith. He's a Black landscape architect based in Washington, D.C., and was really starting as an informal network to help practicing landscape architects, Black landscape architects, get to know one another, offer informal support, a lot of that. But in recent months, there's been a lot of pressure to formalize the organization into a 501c3 with an actual mission and actual objectives. And so that's happened. So we're waiting the actual paperwork now, 501c3 nonprofit paperwork, but there's currently a partnership with a nonprofit in DC. So it's a formal organization. It's made up of students. There's a Facebook group, Black Landscape Architects Students Network. So if you're on Facebook, you can go there. There's a LinkedIn group that's more the practitioner side, but students are welcome to join. So if you go to LinkedIn and you Google Black Landscape Architects Network, that's there. The website is coming very soon, in which case we'll direct everybody to that resource and move forward. And so we got seed funding from a philanthropic organization to help with the capacity building piece now, and we're developing strategy. So they have the network has been in contact with your director, Chris Harrison. He's presented actually what you all are doing at A&T to the board. So there's a good relationship there. So yeah, you're welcome to join and participate in the network. Normally, it would be at the annual meeting for ASLA, wherever that occurs, there's a lunch where everybody gets together and we have informal fellowship and connect. And then there's formal sort of exercises associated with that. Because of COVID, we have a different kind of plan. So we'll be able to share that once that gets known. And what I would say about NCSU is a lot of things. I think we welcome people to apply and to work there. Chris got his MLA from NC State and returned to A&T, so he can offer some perspective on strengths, weaknesses, differences. The biggest one is obvious. It's not an HBCU, and so the idea that operating within a predominantly white institution in that environment is just very different than an HBCU. And so there's some cultural things that you'll notice that are a bit different. You'll notice that in the master's program, we have a large number of international students. So a number of students who are arriving to the United States for the first time, who came here specifically to get trained in landscape architecture. And so that's really actually an exciting opportunity because it shows for the global reach of landscape architecture. We have a number of strengths in our department. One is we have a great design build studio. So for people who are interested in the actual construction of landscapes, like what it really takes to put one in the ground, our studio for many years has really excelled in that, where the students design and implement a landscape in 16 weeks. And we have a number of incredible examples of that work over many years around the campus. It's always a campus landscape, and it's really energizing for a lot of the students. We have a number of certificate programs. So in addition to getting your graduate degree, you can specialize in different areas. One is in natural hazards. So we talked a lot about climate change previously in terms of how can we prepare for, a climate that has increasing disruptions and increasing need for recovery. You can actually have sort of a self-directed sequence of courses that can build that expertise in you, combined with landscape architecture. Public interest design, how to work with communities and work with engagement strategies. A city design certificate that talks about urban design. So for people who see themselves really dealing with urban spaces, plazas, streets, how that relates to the city, we offer some focus in that. So for people with a BLA, it puts you in multiple tracks. So based on your level of experience, and strength of your portfolio, it could shorten the time that it takes to actually get through, increase your return on investment there, and also position you for teaching assistantships and graduate assistantships because COVID, we'll see what happens with the budget. But generally speaking, people who have experience in grading or experience in drafting or experience in design, are very valuable as teaching assistants to faculty. So that and that can also help to offset some of the costs associated with education. So, I think our strength is we really focus on our region, but we are very well connected to the broader issues of the profession. And myself and like 5 other faculty are fellows in ASLA. So we have a pretty good sense of where things are going and how they're working. We had an open house. I'm sorry that this talk came later, but we had an open house a few weeks ago where there was a chance for people to ask questions and work out. But it's open. It's a rolling admission. So anytime that people are interested, you can reach out to Meg, our chair, and Carla Delcom, our DGP, for information.
Okay, good. I'll open the floor up one last time to see if there's any students who'd like to ask any other questions. Well, Kofi, this has been really a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Thanks a lot for all that you've shared with us. Is there anything else in closing that you'd like to share with us in terms of your wisdom or advice?
I think it's really challenging times. My studio and my seminar are online, and I can see it in them in terms of sometimes they even ask the question, did I do the right thing? Am I spending my time wisely? Am I making things happen in the way that I want them to? And I realize how that can be a common thought right now that, because of COVID, because of a lot of situations, can make it very difficult to stay motivated. But the message I want to share is that our profession needs you. It is poor by not having your voice in the room. It's richer by having you participate. So I would say that what I tell my students is to focus on one thing right now. There's so many things coming at you, in terms of stressors and difficult things. But there's always one thing that motivates you, right? One thing that you want to get out of a particular project, one thing you want to get out of your time, one thing you want to get out of a class, one thing you want to get out of just the day. And sometimes if you can build from that one thing, right, you can say, hey, I can do one thing. It becomes 2 things, it becomes 4 things, it becomes 8 things. And landscape architecture is a very broad and very increasingly powerful profession. It's going to be one of the leading professions that's going to help us figure out how we're going to live on Earth for the time to come. And so I would encourage you not to lose sight of that, despite all these short-term challenges, over time you'll see that we are very important to the future. So please, I wish you much success as you finish your semesters. We encourage you to reach out at any time. For sure, if you can, join the network, and we hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you, Kofi. It's been really wonderful. Really appreciate you spending this time with us.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate it too. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Okay, you too.